Hi everyone, my name is Rob Patton and I am the co-founder and CEO of Ruddr. In this video, I'll provide a brief demonstration of 10 of the more popular features in Ruddr. First, we'll take a look at time tracking. We'll follow that up with expense tracking, and from there we'll look at approval workflow. Next will be the project dashboard, then resource allocation. We'll move on to forecasting, then billing. We'll look at utilization tracking, then we'll look at client approvals, and we'll finish up with financial reporting. Let's jump in and get started. Okay, we're looking at the time entry screen within Ruddr. The first thing to point out about this screen is that you've got 4 different views on your time entries. So we're looking at the day view here, which is showing that we don't have any time entries yet for December 16th. We can switch to the week view and see all of our time entries for the current week. Then we can switch to the month view and see our time entries for the month. And lastly, we can switch to a list view where we can scroll infinitely through all of our past time entries. There are a couple of things to point out about these time views. First, you can navigate forward and backward through the calendar using this control at the top left of the screen. When the day view is selected, these arrows will take us forward or backward by a day. Similarly, when the week view is selected, we can go forward or backward for an entire week, and the month view works the same way. The other thing to point out is that if your security role within your workspace gives you administrative rights to the time entries of other workspace members, you'll see this Teammates drop-down at the top right of the time screen. Depending on your security role within your workspace, you'll see either all workspace members, or just the members of your practice, or just those members that are subordinate to you within the organization. To interact with another member's timesheet, just select that member from the Teammates dropdown. If we want to create a time entry from this day view, we just click on the New Time Entry button here in the center of the screen. Then we put in the amount of time that we worked. We select the project that we worked on. Note that when we select the project, if that project uses roles or tasks, we'll be presented with those drop-downs. In this case, I can choose that I worked on the project manager role, and then I can see the open tasks for that role. I'll choose requirements gathering, and you'll notice at the bottom of this new time entry drawer, I now have some information about that task. I can see that the task is budgeted for 120 total hours. We've worked 45.5 hours thus far, which is 37.9% of the budget, and we've got 74.5 hours remaining, which is 62.1% of the budget. I can also see some details such as the status of the task, whether or not it's billable, and who it's assigned to. The last thing I may want to do is just type in some notes. Once I've got those entered, I click this Save and Close button at the bottom right of the screen, and our new time entry has been created. A lot of Ruddr users prefer the week view for entering their time. On the week view, the list of projects that we're working on is shown here down the left-hand side of the screen, and then the days of the current week are shown across the screen. We can see that 2.5 hour time entry that we just created on the day view. If we worked some time on that same project and task earlier in the week, we can just click on those days and add the amount of time that we worked. You'll also notice that at the bottom of the month, week, and day views, you'll see this statistics bar. This bar will show the total number of hours entered. It'll show the categorization of those hours, such as how many were billable versus non-billable. You'll then see in the center area here the status of those hours. We can see that we've got 39.25 hours that haven't been submitted yet. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we can see the utilization figures associated with this time frame. These show us our billable utilization, our client utilization, and our total utilization. Billable utilization is our billable hours divided by our capacity. Client utilization is both our billable and our non-billable client hours divided by capacity. And total utilization is all of our working hours divided by our capacity. Once we've got all of our hours in for a given week, we just click this Submit Timesheet button at the bottom right of the screen, and that submits all of our time entries for approval. And that's a quick summary of time tracking in Ruddr. The next feature we'll take a look at is expense tracking. Expense tracking is one of the more commonly accessed features within Ruddr. We're currently looking at the expense reports screen, which is showing us all of our expense reports for the time frame selected here at the top left of the screen. We're currently looking at our 17 expense reports for 2022, but we could select a prior year using this dropdown. At the right of this screen is the same teammates dropdown that we saw earlier on the time screens. If you have administrative rights to the expense items of other members of the workspace, you'll see those members in this teammates dropdown. Each of our expense reports has a report number, a report title, notes, and a report date. Also, we can see the number of expense items on each report, whether or not those items have been approved, and we can see the total dollar amount of the expense report. If we want to see the details of this expense report numbered 1120, we can just click on this expense report row, and that'll bring us to the expense report details screen. From this screen, we can see the summary information about the expense report at the top, including the amount that's reimbursable to this member, the amount that's billable to the client, and the total amount of this expense report. And then we can see the individual expense items on this expense report. To get the detail on any of these items, just click on the row, and that brings up the Edit Item drawer. From here, we can see the status, the expense category, the vendor name, the expense date and amount, the project that the expense is associated with, if it's associated with the project. Then we can see whether it's reimbursable to me, whether it's billable to the client, and lastly, we can see our notes here. If the expense item has had a receipt uploaded, we'll be able to see that receipt on this Receipts tab. A couple of other things to point out about this expense report details screen are that you can export these expense items in a number of different formats. Also, at the bottom right, you can click this down arrow and choose to import expenses into the expense report. To do that, just follow the format outlined in this expenses CSV file. Next, we'll go ahead and create a new expense report. To do that, just click the New Expense Report button at the bottom right of the screen. Then we'll type in the name of our expense report. We'll select the expense report date and any notes that we have about this expense report. Then we'll click the Save and Close button, and that'll bring up the new expense report. From here, we just click the New Expense Item button to add our first expense item to this expense report. We'll choose airfare, type in our vendor name, select the date, put in the amount of this expense. If it's associated with the project, we'll select that project. We'll say that this expense is billable to the client, and then we'll put in any notes that we have about this expense. If we have a receipt for this expense, we'll click on the Receipts tab, click here, select our receipt, and then hit Save and Close. Now we've got our first expense item on this expense report. There are a couple of special conditions that exist for specific expense categories. For example, you'll notice that if I choose this Client Prospect Entertainment category, there's a new Attendees text area here at the bottom of this new item drawer. The Workspace admin has the option to turn on this Attendees text box for any expense category. Also, if you choose Mileage as the expense category, you'll notice that we're asked for the number of miles and then a cost per mile. You'll also notice that the expense amount is calculated for us here. Mileage is a special type of expense category called a unit expense category, and the Workspace admin can create as many unit expense categories as they like. The last thing to mention about expense reporting in Ruddr is that the submission process is similar to the time submission process. All you need to do is click this Submit for Approval button at the bottom right of the screen, and your expense report has been submitted, and each of the individual expense items have been routed to their approvers. And that wraps up our summary of expense tracking in Ruddr. Next, we're going to take a look at approval workflow. When setting up a new project using the Edit Project drawer, we can set our approval workflow in this Approval Options section. We can set up separate workflow for time approval and expense approval. We can set time and expenses to either be automatically approved or manually approved. If we choose manual approval, then we can click this Edit Workflow button, which allows us to set the approval workflow. By default, the approver will be the project admin of the project. The project admin is typically the person responsible for overseeing the delivery of the project. We can add additional approval steps by clicking this Add Step button. There are both role approvers and member approvers. We'll go ahead and choose the client relationship owner as the second step approver, and then we'll choose the member's manager as the third step, and finally we'll pick a couple of named members as the fourth step. As you can see, you can have more than one approver at each step of the workflow. Also, you can change the order of the workflow steps just by dragging and dropping. Now that we've got the workflow right for this project, we'll just click this Update Workflow button and then the Save and Close button on the Edit Project drawer. When time entries have been submitted that require your approval, you'll see this red dot indicator next to the Time main navbar menu option. Then beneath that, you'll see a red indicator with the number of items pending your approval next to the Approvals menu option. When you click that menu option, you'll be shown this Approvals screen. We can see here that a total of 10 time entries have been submitted for our approval. We've got 5 time entries for Cameron that total 39.25 client billable hours, and we have 5 time entries for Gordon that total 35.75 client billable hours. If we want to review the individual time entries, we can just expand these rows and then click on each time entry. We could also make changes to the information on this edit entry drawer. Note that when a time entry is pending approval, we can put our mouse over the amount of time and we'll see a pop-up with the approval workflow for that time entry. We can approve or reject time entries one at a time using the thumbs up and thumbs down buttons here on the right-hand side of the list. If we reject a time entry, we're required to put in the reason for that rejection. Also, we can approve and reject in bulk using these checkboxes here on the left-hand side of the screen. If I want to approve all of these time entries for Cameron and Gordon, I can just select those checkboxes and then click this Approve button at the bottom right of the screen. At this point, my entire approval queue has been cleared out. And that concludes this brief demonstration of approval workflow in Ruddr. Next, we'll take a look at the project dashboard. Every project in Ruddr has a project dashboard. The project dashboard provides the primary information about the project. We can see that this project is called Vendor Portal and Mobile App, and it's being delivered for a client called Home Improvement Gurus. The default tab of the project dashboard is this Overview tab, but we also have tabs for the team, tasks, time entries, expense items, invoices, client approvals if those are turned on for the project, resource allocations, and files. For the purposes of this demonstration, we'll just focus on the Overview tab. Along the right-hand side of the Overview tab is the Project Details pane. This area gives you all of the high-level configuration information about this project. We can see who the project admin is, we can see the billing type, the budget, the project type, the practice, and so on. Below this project details section is the client details pane that includes similar high-level information about this client. At the top of the Overview tab is the Project Progress Graph. The Project Progress Graph can show us either hours or services revenue. Note that we'll only be able to see the services revenue if our security role within the workspace allows us to see revenue on this particular project. On the hours view of this Project Progress Graph, we can see the actual hours that have been delivered to date in green, and then the projected future hours in the yellow dotted line. Those projected hours come from the resource allocations on this project. We can also see the start date and the end date, as well as the budget, which for this project is 2,800 hours. Just by looking at this project progress graph, we can see that this project is going to go well over budget, both in terms of hours and schedule. Beneath the graph, we're shown the billable hours, non-billable hours, and total hours. Beneath those figures, we can see the budget, budget left, and projected left for each of those three figures. When we switch the project progress graph to show services revenue, we see slightly different information. On the graph, we're now seeing earned revenue in green and projected future revenue in the dotted yellow line. Then at the bottom, we can see our earned services revenue to date, as well as the budget, how much is remaining in the budget, and how much is projected left on the project based on the resource allocations. And in this area to the right, we show the current effective bill rate on the project, as well as the budget and whether or not we are above or below budget. The effective bill rate is the services revenue divided by the total number of hours worked on the project to date. Beneath the project progress graph, we have some important key performance indicators on this project. The first one of these is the realization rate. The realization rate is the percentage of the hours worked to date on the project that have been billable. We can see that 93.7% of the hours to date have been billable, but that's below the budget of 98.8%. The next KPI is the effective bill rate. We can see that that's 169.94, which is also below budget of 174.65. Next, we've got the margin on the project, which in this case is 53%. And then beneath this row, we have the revenue, expenses, and hours. We can see both actual and budget for hours and expenses. And then for revenue, we can see the budget revenue, the earned revenue, and the invoiced revenue to date. And that's a quick overview of the project dashboard in Ruddr. The next area we'll take a look at is resource allocation. The resource allocation module within Ruddr is used to assign project work to either workspace members or resource placeholders. Resource placeholders are used when you aren't sure just yet which workspace member will be assigned to the project team. On the left-hand side of this screen, we can select the date, and we can also move forward or backward through the calendar. At the center of the screen, we can select the time interval to use for the resource allocation grid. We can set this to either a month, week, or day view. And on the right-hand side of the screen here, we can filter the resource allocations, we can export the allocations, and we can click this plus button to create a new allocation. This main area of the screen here is called the Resource Allocation Grid. The Resource Allocation Grid shows the summary values for the metric identified here at the top right of the screen. The Resource Allocation Grid can show allocated hours, available hours, billable utilization, or target attainment. On the left-hand side of the screen here, we can choose to group the resource allocations either by member or by project. When the allocations are grouped by member, you'll see members here down the left-hand side of the screen, and when you expand a member, you'll see the individual projects that the member is allocated to. When the allocations are grouped by project, you'll see the clients and projects down the left-hand side of the screen, and then when you expand a project, you'll see the team members that have been allocated to it. So we're currently looking at the allocated hours by month on the resource allocation grid. We can put our mouse over any cell on the grid to get some more detailed information. For example, we can see that for April 2023, we have 960 hours of capacity, and we've currently allocated 798 hours. That leaves 162 hours available to be allocated. Also, we can see that the projected billable utilization for the month will be 72%, and the aggregated utilization target for the entire workspace is 69.17% for the month. This yields a projected target attainment of 104% for April 2023. If we want to see all of the resource allocations, we can just click the down arrow on the total summary row. and that will expand all of the allocations. From here, we can click on any individual allocation to bring up the Edit Allocation drawer. We could then make any changes that we need to make to that allocation and click the Save and Close button. Note that each cell of the resource allocation grid will have a color associated with it. This creates a heat map which includes dark green colors when a metric is optimal and dark red colors when a metric could be concerning. For example, we can see here that Donna Clark has a dark red color for the month of April 2023. This is being caused by her being over allocated by 28 hours. She has 160 hours of capacity, but her allocations for the month total 188 hours. To resolve this over allocation issue, we can just expand the row for Donna and move out one of her allocations to better balance out the month. Evaluating the allocated hours and unallocated hours can be valuable for personnel responsible for resource allocation within the company. But you might find even more value from the billable utilization metric or the billable utilization target attainment metric. With the billable utilization metric selected, we can see the planned billable utilization for the entire company by month, and we can also see that value for each member within the workspace. When we switch the metric to target attainment, we're now seeing the projected billable utilization target attainment for the entire company as well as for each individual workspace member. The workspace admin can set the target billable utilization for each workspace member. So with this target attainment metric selected, we can see that we're planned to achieve at least a 90% target attainment for every month from January through May of 2023. This target attainment metric is very helpful in informing the future recruiting needs of the organization. Since the entire company is operating near target through May, we may need to start recruiting in the event that we sell some additional projects in the interim. And that provides a brief overview of the resource allocation functionality within Ruddr. The next top feature that we'll take a look at is forecasting. Forecast information within Ruddr can be found in two different areas. First, on the project dashboard for each project, we can see a forecast of the remaining hours on the project. That forecast is shown here in a yellow dotted line, and it's based off of the resource allocations for this project. And then second, we can switch this drop down to services revenue, and now we can see the projected services revenue for the remainder of the project. It's important to point out that a workspace member can only see these hours or this services revenue if their security role within the workspace gives them permission to view that information. The other area of Ruddr where we can see forecast information is within the forecast section of reports. The first two forecast reports allow us to see an hours forecast by project and resource, or an hours forecast by resource and project. We'll go ahead and click on the hours forecast by project and resource. This report is showing us all of the forecasted hours in the workspace through June of 2023. We're shown a row in bold for each project that has the totals for each month of the report. If we want to see this report in more granular detail, we could switch the time unit from month to either week or day. Underneath each project, we have the members on the project as well as the resource placeholders on the project. The resource placeholder icon shows multiple people, and the workspace member icon shows a single person. If we scroll to the bottom of this report, we can see the total figures for the entire workspace, including all projects that have resource allocations. At the far right, we can see that we have 5,277.5 allocated hours through the month of June 2023. If we want to filter this report to bring up specific clients or specific projects, we can do that, or we can export this data to CSV or Microsoft Excel format. In addition to forecasting the hours per project, we may also want to forecast the services revenue per project. The services revenue forecast by client and project shows us this information. We can see the clients and projects down the left-hand side of the screen here, and then across the screen, we can see the amount of services revenue projected by month. And once again, at the bottom of this report, we get the total by month and then the grand total at the bottom right. The last forecast-related report that we'll look at is the hours variance by project and resource. This report will show us how the actual hours worked varied from what we were expecting based on the resource allocations. So we can see here that Donna worked 3.5 hours less than expected in October. We can see that Rob worked 82 hours more than expected, and so on down the line. If we put our mouse over any one of these figures, we'll get some more detail. And that's a quick summary of the forecasting capabilities within Ruddr. The next top feature we'll take a look at is billing. There are 4 billing types within Ruddr, and these are time and materials, fixed fee, fixed monthly, and non-billable. We'll take a quick look at a time and materials project setup and a fixed fee project setup. This digital transformation project is set up to use time and materials billing. We can see that by scrolling down on this overview tab to the billing section. Time and materials projects within Ruddr will either attach bill rates directly to project team members or to project roles. This is determined by this Use Roles checkbox. We can see that this project is using roles, which means it will have a Roles tab at the top of the screen here. We can see each project role, whether or not that role is billable, and then the bill rate associated with that role. Below the project roles section, we can see the role assignments. Each project team member can be assigned to one or more of the roles that are defined above. Now that we've seen a time and materials project, we'll take a look at a fixed fee project's configuration. We'll just edit this public website project, which is set up as a fixed fee. We can see this by scrolling down to the billing section and looking at the billing type. For a fixed fee project, the Accounting tab controls the billing of the project. The fixed fee billing schedule for this project has 4 entries. We'll start by billing $25,000 on December 31st, $50,000 on January 31st, $50,000 on February 28th, and $25,000 on March 31st. The grand total that we'll invoice for this project is $150,000. Note that for any billing type within Ruddr, you'll also have the option to bill for other items to bill or project expenses. Other items to bill might include products that your company sells, and the expenses ledger might include large expenses that come into accounts payable at your company and that don't hit an individual team member's expense report. Now that we've looked at the setup of both a time and materials project and a fixed fee project, we'll head over to the Ready to Bill screen. The Ready to Bill screen is a real-time accrual of the services revenue, expenses revenue, and other items revenue that's ready to be billed for this date range here at the top left of the screen. This date range will default to the current month, but you can switch that to various other date ranges, or you can choose a custom date range. If you also want to invoice for revenue items that occurred before this date range, you just click this Invoice for Prior Billable Items checkbox, and those items will be brought forward here on the Ready to Bill screen. So we can see that for this month of December 2022, we have 3 projects that are ready to be billed. One of these is a fixed fee project, and the other 2 are time and materials projects. We can see that for this mobile application within Ball Bearings Unlimited, we have a couple of icons. First, we have this yellow warning indicator. That tells us that some of the time entries associated with this services revenue have not been approved. This informational icon here in the expenses cell tells us that we've got one non-billable expense for $456.36. If we click on this icon, we'll be taken to the expense details screen, and we can click on that expense to bring up the expense edit item drawer to determine whether or not this expense should have actually been billable. We'll go ahead and set this one to build a client, and then when we go back to the Ready to Bill screen, we can see that that billable amount is now in the expenses column for the mobile application project. To create an invoice for this digital transformation project within Acme Company, we'll just click on this checkbox, and then we'll click the Create Invoice button at the bottom right of the screen. We'll confirm on this window, and now we've got a draft invoice. If we need to change any of this information in the header area of the invoice, we can just click on this pencil icon, which opens up the invoice header drawer. We might choose to put in a PO number on this screen or adjust the payment terms. Something else that we might also want to adjust is the display of the information in this details column. We're currently showing the project name and the role name, but we might also want to show the name of the individual that did the work. To do that, we just click on this Settings button, and then we can adjust the grouping of the time entries. We'll switch this to Group by Project Role and Person, and then click Apply. Now we can see that for every line item on this invoice, we've got the name of the person who did the work in addition to the name of the role. As we scroll down this invoice, we can see the services revenue invoice line items, and we can see a couple of expense invoice line items. If we needed to reorder any of these line items, we could do that just by grabbing this handle on the left-hand side of the row and then moving the row into its appropriate position. If we needed to apply tax to any invoice line item, we can just click this tax checkbox in the tax column. At the bottom of the invoice, we can type in a note to this client, and we can supply a discount for the invoice. At this point, we're ready to save and preview the invoice, and we do that by clicking on this button at the bottom of the screen. Now we're looking at a preview of this draft invoice. Note that for this invoice, we have a couple of options turned on. First, if there are receipts associated with the expense items on this invoice, our client will be able to click this View Receipts button to see those receipts. Similarly, we've enabled a View Time Detail button on this invoice. When the client clicks this button, They'll get a detailed list of the time entries associated with the services revenue on this invoice. They'll also be able to download these time entries in CSV format. The client will also be able to download a PDF version of this invoice. Once we're done with the preview, we just click this Close button, and assuming that the invoice is good to go, we're ready to publish it. To publish the invoice, we just click this Publish button at the bottom right of the screen, and then we confirm on this window here. Now the invoice is published and it can no longer be edited within Ruddr. The last step of the process is to send this invoice to the client. We do that by clicking on this Send button, which brings up the Send Invoice drawer. From here, we can customize the message to the client, we can attach additional files to the email, and then we can hit the Send button. The client will receive an email with a button that'll bring up that digital version of the invoice, and they'll also get a PDF version of the invoice attached to the email. And that wraps up our basic overview of billing within Ruddr. The next top feature we'll take a look at is Utilization Tracking. From the Workspace Settings area of Ruddr, the Workspace admin can click on any workspace member and set that member's capacity. The capacity is the total number of hours per day that the member is expected to work. The default is 8 hours per day, Monday to Friday, but you could change that by clicking on this pencil button and then adjusting the hours. Note that the capacity should be set to the member's total working hours per day and not to their expected billable hours per day. To set their billable target, we go to the Target tab and then we adjust the target billable utilization. We can see that my target is 80% here, and I can just click the pencil icon and move that up or down as needed. This combination of capacity and target per workspace member allows Ruddr to accurately calculate utilization figures for each member and for the entire workspace. When a member logs into Ruddr, they'll be taken to their personal dashboard. Their personal dashboard shows an accounting of all of their time entries for the current week. This includes client billable hours in green, client non-billable hours in red, internal hours in yellow, and time off hours in light blue. Below these hours figures, we have 3 utilization metrics for this week to date. The first is the billable utilization, which is the person's billable hours divided by their capacity. Then the middle one here is the client utilization, which is the sum of the billable hours and non-billable client hours divided by capacity. And then the third one on the right here is the total utilization. That's the sum of all client hours, both billable and non-billable, plus the internal hours divided by the capacity. Note that on the billable hours metric, we can see the target that we set previously within the member settings. Also, we can adjust the time frame for the personal dashboard using this drop-down at the top right of the screen. So we could look at this month to date, or last week, or last month, and then make comparisons. Notice that as we change the date range, the utilization numbers here at the bottom of the screen also change. This personal dashboard is a great way for workspace members to keep up with their time entry and ensure that they're meeting expectations. Another way to evaluate utilization is to use the utilization reports within the reporting section of Ruddr. Each member will always have permission to view their own utilization, but they may also have permission to view the utilization of other members in the workspace. This depends on the security role assigned to each member. As an example of a utilization report, we'll click on this billable utilization by week. We'll go ahead and set the date range to the last 4 weeks and click Apply. A couple of other filters are applied to this report by default. First, we have the member type defaulted to employee, and we have the member's workspace billability defaulted to billable. These two defaults are set because most companies tend to measure utilization for their billable full-time employees, but you can adjust these filters as needed. This report shows both a graphical representation of the billable utilization as well as a table-based representation of the utilization. If we put our mouse over any point on the graph, we can see the billable utilization at that point, or we can see the rows here at the bottom. If we want to export this data, we just use this export button here at the top right of the screen. Another good utilization report to look at is the utilization by member. The utilization by member will show us the members down the left-hand side of the screen here, and then we can see each member's capacity, their billable hours, their billable utilization, client utilization, total utilization, and then we can also see that member's target billable utilization and their target attainment percentage. And once again, we can filter this report, or we can download this report to either CSV or Excel. And that's a brief summary of utilization tracking within Ruddr. Next, we'll take a look at client approvals. Client approvals are an optional feature in Ruddr that can be enabled on a per-project basis. Client approvals are ideal for situations where your client requires that all time and expenses be submitted for their approval before you invoice the client. To enable client approvals for a project, you just edit that project and then scroll down to the Approval Options section and check this checkbox that says Enable Client Approvals. We can see that this digital transformation project currently has 2 past client approvals. We can just click on either of these to get the detail. We can see that this client approval is for the time frame of November 1st, 2022 through November 30th. It's for 123 total billable hours and $898.70 in total billable expenses. The Time tab here is showing all of the hours summarized by team member, and we can expand any one of these team members to see the detail. Then the Expenses tab will show all of the billable expenses summarized by member. We can see that this client approval has already been sent to the client, and all of the time and expenses are already approved. To create a client approval for the current month, we just click this Create a Client Approval button. This will default to this month. We can choose whether to include billable hours or billable expenses or both on this client approval. Also, we can turn on this daily reminder email. This will send the client a daily reminder if they don't respond to the client approval within the number of days set here. Similarly, we have an option to auto-approve the items within this client approval if the client doesn't respond within the number of days set here. To create this client approval, we just click the Save button. We can see that this client approval for the month of December has 344.5 total hours and $34.84 in total expenses. We can email this to the client by clicking this Send button here, and then we can type in our message and just click Send. The email that your client receives will look like this. It'll have your logo at the top left, it'll say Approval Request at the top right, then it will have your message, and at the bottom here will be a summary of the billable time and expenses that need approval. Your client contact will just click on this Review Items button to bring up the client approval. Now, an important thing to note here is that your client doesn't need a login to Ruddr in order to approve these items. Also, the client will have no access to your Ruddr workspace. Your client contact can review each of the time entries and just click the thumbs up button or the thumbs down button. Also, they'll be able to click this thumbs up button for an entire row to approve all of those items for that row. This progress bar is shown at the bottom left of the screen, and we can see that this client approval is 20% complete. To make it easy for the client contact to approve all of these items at once, they can just click this checkbox here at the top left and then click the Approve button at the bottom right. We can now see that all of the time on this client approval has been approved, and there are just 2 remaining expense items to be approved. Next, the client contact will need to review the expenses. When we click on the Expenses tab, we can expand the expenses, and your client contact will be able to approve these as well. Note that once all of the time and expenses have a disposition, Ruddr will show this Submit Approval Request window. From here, your client contact will just type in his or her name and click the Submit button. Now we can see that this client approval has been submitted by Susan Jones on December 29th. We can see that all of the items are approved and there's no further action to take. Once the client contact submits the client approval, the project admin of the project will be notified. The project admin can then go to this Client Approvals tab on the project and review the details for the approval. And that's a summary of client approvals within Ruddr. And the final feature that we're going to take a look at is financial reporting. The financial reports within Ruddr can be found within this Financial section of reports. There are a number of financial reports available, but we'll just take a look at a few of them. The first financial report we're going to look at is the Hourly Fees by Client and Project report. The Hourly Fees by Client and Project report is very useful for companies that tend to do a lot of time and materials based projects. We can see that this report defaults to the current month to date, and the project billing type defaults to time and materials. The report will show a summary row for each client and also a row for each project that had hours during the reporting period. If the project uses roles, the report will show each role that had hours, and if the project doesn't use roles, the report will just show the members assigned to that project that had hours. So we can see here that Acme Company had a total of 344.5 billable hours, 5.5 non-billable hours, for a total of 350 hours for the reporting period. The services revenue generated on those hours was $57,877.50. We can see each individual project role and its associated bill rate. The next financial report that we'll take a look at is the Fixed Fee Revenue by Client and Project report. We'll look at this for a date range that includes all dates. We can see that by default, this report shows project billing types of fixed fee and fixed monthly. As you can see here, the report shows us the invoice services revenue, the uninvoiced services revenue, the recognized services revenue, and the unrecognized services revenue. Fixed fee projects in Ruddr can be configured to use either as invoiced revenue recognition or manual revenue recognition. With manual revenue recognition, the amount that's been invoiced can vary from the amount that's been recognized to date. This report makes it easy to keep track of how much of the services revenue has been invoiced and how much of the services revenue has been recognized. The next financial report that we'll take a look at is the performance by project report. The performance by project report is a list of all projects that had hours or revenue during the reporting period. We can see here that we've got 4 projects that qualify for the report in the default period of this month to date. We can also see that this report is showing all 3 billing types by default. We're shown the hours per project, the realization rate, which is the percentage of those hours that were billable, the revenue, the effective bill rate, which is the services revenue divided by the total number of hours worked, the cost, profit, profit margin, the budget revenue, and the budget revenue that remains. In this case, none of these 4 sample projects were set up with a budget. When this report is exported to CSV or Excel format, a number of additional columns are provided. The last financial report that we'll take a look at is performance by member. The performance by member report is similar to the performance by project report, except we show workspace members here down the left-hand side of the screen. The columns to the right include the total hours worked by that member, the realization rate, the services revenue generated, the effective bill rate, the cost, the profit, and the profit margin. This report is helpful for understanding where the company is generating its best profit margin. There are a number of other financial reports here that you can experiment with. Well, that does it for this look at the top 10 features within Ruddr. Thank you for your time today.